Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices. First, I would like to thank all of you for your letters and comments, and would like to encourage you to continue sending them as it keeps us on track. Our speaker today is Ms. Irena Zubcevic, a former representative of the government of Croatia to the United Nations, and currently Chief of the Intergovernmental Policy Review Branch in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA. Ms. Zubcevic has been on our programs for many, many years and is a known authority on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our moderator, Apur Kabir Gupta, will now continue. Apur.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach, and welcome to our program, Ms. Zubcevic. It really is an honor to have you with us, joining the Virtual Voices series. As Dr. Durbach articulated, Ms. Zubcevic is the Chief of the Intergovernmental Policy and Review Branch at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA. In her current position, she supports work of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development by the ECOSOC and the Second Committee of the General Assembly. Today, Ms. Zubcevic will be talking to us about COVID-19, biodiversity, and the Sustainable Developmental Goals. We're very much looking forward to your presentation. Ms. Zubcevic, over to you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dr. Durbach and Apur. I'm honored to be invited to participate in this series. I really want to emphasize that we have had a very long relation with World Information Transfer, and I'm really honored to be here. And we are having this conversation at the time when the whole world is faced not only with health crisis, but human crisis attacking societies at their core. I would first like to express a solidarity with all countries affected by the pandemic and condolences and sympathy to the families of the victims of COVID-19 and those whose lives and livelihoods have been affected by the crisis. We are all deeply concerned by the human illness and deaths worldwide caused by COVID-19 pandemic, the negative impact on physical and mental health and social well-being, the negative impacts on economies and societies, and the consequent exacerbation of inequalities within and between countries. We know that there are over 7 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 to date in the world, and over 400,000 people have died worldwide. And of course, our first response needs to be to contain the pandemic and keep health workers and first responders safe. But it is easier said than done. This pandemic has exposed the fragility of public health systems in many countries, be it because the access to medical services is not available to all, be it because of lack of hospital capacity to care for so many patients, be it because of lack of equipment or ability to test and trace the virus and provide proper quarantine. We need to increase research and development funding for vaccines and medicines, leverage digital technologies, and strengthen scientific international cooperation in response to COVID-19, and to bolster coordination, including with the private sector, towards rapid development, manufacturing and distribution of diagnostics, antiviral medicines, personal protective equipment, and vaccines, adhering to the objectives of efficacy, safety, equity, accessibility, and affordability. We also need to underline the important role of extensive immunization against COVID-19 and to make sure it becomes a global public good for health in preventing, containing, and stopping transmission in order to bring the pandemic to an end once safe, quality, efficacious, effective, accessible, and affordable vaccines are available. It is extremely important and essential to uphold freedom of expression and allow unimpeded access to free flow of accurate and timely information for public health purposes without suppression, while countering misinformation online and offline with accurate, clear, and evidence-based information, and avoiding efforts that could result in censorship or protected speech, thus endangering human rights and the rule of law. But the impact of the pandemic is much larger. We need to emphasize the multidimensional nature of the pandemic and its severe impacts on human security, which adds to the challenges faced by all countries, especially developing countries and countries in special situations, and threatens to reverse recent progress and reinforce pre-existing obstacles, gaps, and systemic challenges in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The pandemic has unprecedented socioeconomic impact, where the third of the global population was in the virtual lockdown. Of course, we are seeing nowadays that it's opening up gradually. And the hardest hit are women and children, youth, low-wage workers, small and medium enterprises, the informal sector, and vulnerable groups. But many more are impacted all over the world, as many industries such as tourism, hospitality, retail, transport have suffered huge losses and had either to let their employees go or furlough them. As proposed in the report of the United Nations Secretary General on socioeconomic impact of COVID-19, large-scale, coordinated, and comprehensive multilateral response amounting to at least 10% of the global GDP is needed now more than ever. It is a global pandemic, and it is important to ensure that developing countries have the best chance of managing this crisis, or COVID-19 will risk becoming a long-lasting brake on economic recovery, as World Bank has forecasted that the pandemic and shutdown of advanced economies could push as many as 60 million people into extreme poverty, erasing much of the recent progress made in poverty alleviation. But it is also extremely important to build back better. And the only way is to continue achieving sustainable development goals. If we had further advanced in meeting the goals, we would have been better prepared to face this challenge with stronger health systems, fewer people living in extreme poverty, less inequality, a healthier natural environment, and more resilient societies. We must seize the opportunity of this crisis to strengthen our commitment to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. We must also foster green structural transformation of the world economy. Simply reviving the existing carbon-heavy economy will only exacerbate irreversible climate change, biodiversity loss, and other environmental risks. Currently, according to the Nature Journal, global carbon emissions have fallen by more than 8%, and it is projected that the cumulative global emissions for 2020 could drop by anything from 4 to 7%, which would represent the largest drop since the Second World War. According to the same source, the largest reductions were in absolute numbers in the electric power and ground transport sectors, followed by aviation industry. In fact, the scale of the reduction in emissions this year could be similar to the annual emissions reductions that would be required in order to meet the objectives of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. But the big question is whether governments will advance a low-carbon energy agenda as they seek to stimulate the economy. This will require long-term commitments, 5 to 10 years of public spending and pricing reforms, and different approach for major economies such as G20, as well as middle and low-income countries and low-income economies. Major economies will need to get public spending to support private sector green innovation and infrastructure, development of smart grids, transport systems, charging station networks, and sustainable cities. Pricing carbon and pollution and removing fossil fuel subsidies can accelerate the transition, raise the revenues for the necessary public investments, and lower the overall cost of the green transition. adopting a climate-sensitive approach, including directing investment into building sustainable and inclusive economies, and strengthening approaches that enhance both resilience and efficiency, such as promoting climate action and a circular economy, and raising the ambition of nationally determined contributions, need also to be part of the COVID-19 recovery efforts. While middle and low-income economies will need to find suitable ways to alleviate poverty, which is increasingly rural, and reducing land use change. Promising strategies include reallocating irrigation subsidies to expand basic water and sanitation services, fostering adoption of renewable energy and improved energy efficiency technologies in rural areas, market-based incentives to reduce forest loss and degradation, and allocating fossil fuel taxes to fund natural climate solutions. Current crisis has highlighted the need to reduce the risk of the economic, social, and environmental impacts of disasters, many of which are exacerbated by climate change, and there is the need for action at all levels to enhance efforts to build resilience through the sustainable management of ecosystems to reduce the impacts and cost of disasters. But above all, what is needed to effectively respond to global crisis is global solidarity, commitment to international cooperation, and multilateralism. We all need to commit to intensify international cooperation to contain, mitigate, and overcome the pandemic and its consequences through multidimensional, coordinated, innovative, swift, and decisive response, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable people and countries. We need to refocus our action and make sustainable long-term investments to end poverty and inequalities and address the underlying human rights concerns that have left us vulnerable to the pandemic and greatly exacerbated its effects, with a view to building a more inclusive, just, sustainable, and resilient future. This can be done only by engaging all relevant stakeholders, including civil society, human rights defenders, the private sector, and academia, through the establishment of participatory and transparent multi-stakeholder platforms and partnerships to design effective responses and review their implementation. So these are some of the things that I wanted to put on the table for you. And I was thinking that the best way to go forward would be to hear comments and questions from the participants. My main message basically is that we need to recover better. And that means that we have to recover in a more sustainable way. And that the only way that we can do that is if we are going to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Sustainable Development Goals. Because this pandemic has shown how much inequalities matter, how much inequalities exist in the countries, and how much they matter when you are faced with such a huge pandemic, and also how much response matters, and that we cannot afford to have another pandemic like this and not being ready for it. So the resilience and how resilient we are, and when I say resilient, I mean resilient in all sectors, not just usually resilience is associated with disasters and environmental disasters. But we also have to be resilient in our economies. We have to be also resilient in our societies. So I will stop here, and I would be very glad to hear your views and your comments, and also any questions that you might have for me. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask a question, Irena. In 1994, there was a population summit in Cairo, the UN Population Summit. And in that summit, it was pointed out that the population was growing very, very rapidly, and that we need to address the issue. Do you have any thoughts on why has this issue been completely neglected? Since that time, we have added about 3.5 billion of people, well, not since 1994, but since 1972, 3.5 billion people. So now we're over 7 billion people, 7.8, I believe, at this point.
Do you want me to answer this question, or you want a few questions, and should I answer now? Okay, so I wouldn't say that this issue has been completely neglected, because we have a Commission on Population and Development that at the UN that meets every year, and the all those experts that deal in population, I'm not an expert in that area, but they meet every year and they discuss the issues and the access to sexual and reproductive rights, and looking how to further these issues worldwide. And also, you might have seen that when you look at the forecast, the population is not actually, will not be growing as fast as this was predicted, especially in the 90s. It is actually slowing down. The issue is that it's very uneven in the world. So you have those countries which even have a negative birth rate, a negative, it's called something else, but it's a negative. So there are more people who are being who are dying than are being born in some countries, and you have a big issue on that. And there is a lot is being done, for example, for elderly population in some of these countries. And then there are countries that have a very young population, and there the birth rate is much higher. So I think that the issue is that it's not evenly distributed across the world. So there are parts of the world which are really aging, and they don't have young population. You can, for example, an example is Japan. They are the country that has the oldest population in the world. And you can see when you look at their development of their technology is actually oriented towards elderly population, how to help them to stay more active longer, and how to stay at home longer. So they have all this artificial intelligence that is helping them. And then you have a young continent like Africa, where the population is really young, and it's growing. So I would say that the thing is much about the unevenness, and not so much that overall the population will not grow as rapidly as was expected. And of course, you know that all of this is very much connected to culture and religion and the customs of each country. So the UN Population Commission on the Population and Development Commission doesn't have an easy job to work with all these countries and to try to further some of the principles that were adopted in Cairo at that time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zubcevic, and Irena, for a wonderful presentation. I actually want to pick up a couple of elements from Dr. Zubcevic's comments and your presentation as well, and take the discussion on the SDGs. In your presentation, you mentioned that we have to be working towards sustainable development and sustainable societies to make our globe more resilient to some of these global crises that happen. And when we're looking at the sustainable developmental agenda, I think the world is now realizing that a lot of it is interconnected, and one problem doesn't really remain isolated. If I was to take the population example, I feel that to quite an extent has led to the pandemic, as societies are coming in closer contact with species, and therefore there's a higher risk of viruses jumping from animals into our species. So there's so many interrelated consequences. So from your perspective, when we're thinking of building these kind of sustainable societies, what kind of interconnections within the SDGs do you think will be most critical to address as we come out of the pandemic and as we sort of begin building back better, as you said?
Everything is interconnected, and I think that one of the greatest strengths of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals is they are all interconnected, and that this interconnectedness of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, economic, social, environmental, has been very much now recognized in this 2030 agenda. You know, people like myself who have been working with sustainable development for over 20 years, we all knew about it, but it was not put at the forefront as it is now with the 2030 agenda. So I think this is a great accomplishment that finally everybody has understood that things are interconnected and you cannot work in silos. And that goes for the national level with governments, but also goes on the international level. So, so this interconnectedness is very important. And as you have also said, with this pandemic, it has actually shown that this interconnectedness exists, and that it needs really to be put into the forefront. What should be done? I think, and I think it has very much been at the forefront of this pandemic is to combat inequalities. I think this has something which has been shown very clearly that those of the population that is well off and has a lot of things that can be used in order to combat the pandemic cannot be done by population who really does not. And if you just think about jobs, many of us can work from home, and I'm the one of the lucky ones who can do that, and I've been doing that for the past 3 months, and it has not affected my job, and my productivity or quality of work that I'm doing. So I'm a lucky one. But there are also a lot of usually low-paid jobs which you have to be somewhere you cannot stay at home and do your work. This has also been seen with the first responders and medical workers. They have to be in hospitals. They have to work in order to, of course, help people, but also to perform their jobs. So it's very important to see how these inequalities that have existed, how they can be addressed in such a way. Of course, nobody is saying that people should all start working from home, or that everybody should have one type of job that gives everybody the same thing and the same security. There will always be different types of jobs. There will be always different situations. So I think that it's very important to look at that, how these inequalities can be addressed in order to have people that wherever they are and whatever they are doing, they can have a kind of a minimal existential ways of doing things that do not affect their dignity as human beings. So I think that is very important. The other thing, what you mentioned about the nature and how often, if I may use this word, we meddle as humans with nature, and then we get caught into all these diseases that might be coming from the nature and making us more vulnerable to them. And this is also now showing that you really need to look at the environment and to see how you can preserve this environment and not to destroy natural habitats, and also how you can do it in such a way that you can utilize it in the best possible way, and also to make sure that it can be used also by future generations. So and then lastly, also this interconnectedness between these 3 dimensions of sustainable development, which is so well reflected both in the 2030 agenda and in the goals that are contained in it. is this 3 dimensions of sustainable development, and saying that, you know, you cannot have the economy with a large inequalities and expect the society to be well functioning. And also to protect the environment, because just to give you an example of deforestation, if you are somebody who is a farmer and needs the land, and you need the land to feed your family, of course you're going to cut the trees. So you need to give this farmer another opportunity so that you can preserve the forests, and at the same time give this person the opportunity to be able to provide for his or her family, and or for him or herself in that way.
Thank you.
There's a
Thank
question
you,
from Alex.
Yes. Ms. Zubcevic, Alex Rosario asks, and I think you would be very well positioned to answer this, given that when we last met many years ago, you headed the Small Island Developing States department in UNDESA. He asks, his question is 2 parts. The first part is, in terms of raising relief funds to take on the pandemic, Europe has the ECB, the United States has the Fed. How do you think underdeveloped countries can raise funds to tackle this situation? Will they mostly rely on aid? And the second part of his question is, within the European context specifically, do you think to quite an extent that this current situation legitimizes or provides a political excuse for harsher border controls against refugees?
Thank you for these actually 2 questions. As you know, the UN Secretary General has also established a fund for helping developing countries, because that's where the countries have fewer resources to be able to bounce back better. And what is important for this is what I already said in my introduction, is global solidarity. So it would be very important to help those countries who cannot do it by themselves, because what is important is that all countries get that kind of response that is needed to address the pandemic. Because if you have countries who cannot do it by themselves and you leave it to their own means, they are going to continue to be the sources of this pandemic, and it doesn't, and as you know, pandemic doesn't stop at the border. So it will be very important for those countries who cannot help and raise resources, or not enough resources internally from their own sources, to help them through the global solidarity. But of course, this also means that every country should look at its own particular circumstances and see how they are best utilizing these funds. So that what you need to do is to have enough, to have strategies and ways how you are going to, whatever you are going to get, to do it in such a way that will benefit everybody, that the whole population would benefit from it. So it's important to, at the same time, to build capacity if it doesn't exist. Technology, especially digital technology, can do a lot nowadays. So this is another way where you can look at, but it's important to see how every country needs to see how best, according to the national circumstances, they can utilize the funds, whether they mobilize them within their own country, or they get it from other countries through global solidarity. Regarding the, I'm not again also an expert on refugees, and I have also said in my introduction that it's very important to have the open flow information and also to respect human rights. Any kind of crisis should not be used to attempt to curtail anybody else's freedoms and rights. So I understand that there has to be some kind of a balance, what you are doing to prevent the spread of the COVID-19, but at this and I know that a lot of European countries have closed their borders, but also amongst themselves. So not only just for refugees, but also for the normal flow of people, and especially in the European Union, as you know, the borders are non-existent anymore. So you can cross from one another, and you don't even see that you have crossed the border. But of course, it should not be used. This pandemic should not be used in a way to advance any of these violations of human rights. All human rights need to be respected, including those rights of the refugees.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and hopefully, Alex, that answers your question. Ms. Zubcevic, I want to ask you, a question on something that you are the expert on and that you're chairing, which is the high-level political forum by ECOSOC in July, and your department is engaged in its preparation. The topic for the HLPF is focused on two things: accelerated action and transformative pathways. And I believe that the outcome of the HLPF is to be a ministerial declaration coming out of that meeting. Can you give us and our viewers a little bit of a flavor of what exactly are the topics that can define this accelerated action and transformative pathways, and what can we hope to see come out of this meeting that hopefully all of us can be very excited about?
Thank you for this question. So first of all, the HLPF, the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, we love acronyms at the UN. So we all call it HLPF, is going to be virtual this year, completely virtual. So that would give some, in a way, it's a lot of work. And of course, it can never replace the in-person meetings, because as if anyone has been at these meetings, you know that it's very vibrant meeting. That there are few thousands of people who come. There are side events, special events. A lot of things are going on. There are a lot of ministers, and many countries present their national implementation of the 2030 agenda, how far they have gone. So it's a very vibrant meeting. So of course, it would be difficult to recreate all this kind of vibes that you get when you are in the meeting itself. But at the same time, it's an opportunity to have many more people, because it will be streamed through the UN TV, through YouTube and other social media. So it's an opportunity for many more people to be able to see and at least get a flavor of what HLPF is all about. When member states decided to have this theme, it was before the pandemic. So that was something we could not have predicted. And basically, these accelerated actions are based on the findings from the scientists that have been published in the Global Sustainable Development Report, which was issued last year. It's an independent group of scientists from all over the world. And they looked at the different at the areas where they thought the accelerated action can get better results for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So these accelerated actions, they looked at these areas, and they saw that of course they have something which they call the well-being, which is the social part of the accelerated actions. We already talked about that. And then also the economic part, but there are also something that this pandemic has especially shown is the food security and food systems. Because as you know, while the pandemic was going on, we had in some parts of Africa, we had a real famine. And so the food security is very much at the forefront of these actions when more needs to be done. And of course, it's also about the environment and the protection and living within the planetary boundaries. So these are the actions where the Global Sustainable Development Report has said these are the things that's where the action is needed. It's also looking at the different levels of government, also saying how local governments are important, and the local level is important because that's where the actual implementation is basically taking place. So that was one of the rationale for that. And then also last year there was the Sustainable Development Goals Summit in September, when heads of state and government came and they produced and agreed to a political declaration which has 10 cross-cutting areas, which are very similar to the ones of the Global Sustainable Development Report. But even a little bit broader, looking also at different ways of financing of the institutions and so on. So these are combined together in this year's HLPF, and then of course the president of ECOSOC with this new development of COVID-19 has also. Wants also the HLPF to look at the impact of the pandemic, and what are the ways that we can, as I just said, we can recover better, which means that we should not go back to our old ways, and should really strive and use this pandemic as a kind of a resetting and really trying to maintain, as I already said in my introduction, that the greenhouse emissions have declined, and that was because of the necessity, because the shutdown of the economies. But the idea is to do as much as possible to continue the good ways of trying to reduce these emissions, and also to build the economy that is greener. To look at the ways to get the circular economy in place, and at the same time to look at the resilience of the societies and how better to protect the environment. So this is what the HLPF is about. You have the revised program, which shows how in some sessions there will be discussions on the impact on COVID of these particular action areas, and how these action areas should be moved forward. And last year's summit also said that this 10 years, because the 2030 agenda is until 2030, as the name says it. So it's the last decade, so it's the last 10 years. So they said this should be a decade of action and delivery. So, and this HLPF should kickstart this action, this decade of action and delivery. So the HLPF will also look at what are these actions that need to happen in order to accelerate the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, because last year's the SDG Progress Report, and even this year's SDG Progress Report, have shown that there is not one single country that would be able to accomplish all 17 goals by 2030. So it would be very important to accelerate actions for the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
And yes, and you mentioned the ministerial declaration. So the ministerial declaration is now being negotiated, and all countries are saying that they want a succinct and action-oriented declaration. So we'll see what they will in the end negotiate, and how this declaration will look like.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, we really look forward to the outcomes of the high-level political forum. You know, as you've known, WIT interns have been covering the HLPF since almost a decade now at the United Nations, and at the United Nations headquarters, and we very much look forward to sort of how robust this one can be, especially in the face of an ongoing crisis. I guess I want to sort of take the discussion to a more present moment now, Irena. You know, there is a reality that we're facing, which is immediately going to hit us. We will have a lot of inequality that is going to grow in terms of job losses that people are going to face, in terms of people losing livelihoods, along with sort of, you know, potential lives as well within communities. But at the same time, we also have a much larger threat than COVID in terms of climate change that is fast approaching us. So we have sort of this new reality where we've almost backtracked on many of the SDGs. So how do we put them back on track, and how do we incentivize our global system to finally embed sustainability in how they do? Because I can easily see companies going back to fossil fuels as a cost-saving strategy, you know, recovering from the pandemic. A lot of people, sort of the digitalization agenda increasing across governments, across businesses, and that will sort of put people out of jobs as more automation takes place. So how can we confront this new reality in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and I probably will be, I don't know, a billionaire if I knew the answer to that one, or a magic wand. But what needs to, and I agree with you. I mean, the easiest probably way for some would be just to go back to the old ways, and you know, and to backtrack, because we have to be aware that a lot of systemic issues that prevented the SDGs to be on track as it should be have you know, are still there. They have not gone with the pandemic. They can only have been exacerbated, as I've said in my introduction, by the pandemic. So I do feel that what needs to be done is really to have this kind of awareness that only in the long term sustainable development is the only answer. And I think that why sustainable development, it has taken if we think about that the first awareness of sustainable development came with the Stockholm conference in the 70s, and then the first Rio conference in the 90s, why it has taken so many years to come to the forefront with the 2030 agenda is because sustainable development is all about long term. And usually when you have policymakers are not long term. They are what, in their office, it might be 4 years, 5 years. If they get 2 terms, maybe 10 years, but that's about it. And sustainable development is about a long-term investments and a long-term pathways, which need to be done in a very systemic way, and that is very difficult. And so that's why it has taken so long for a lot of policymakers to understand that everything is interconnected, and that only if they develop in such a way that they look at all 3 dimensions of sustainable development, that is the only way how they can achieve something in the long run. And we already have a lot of those who are engaged in modeling and looking at different scenarios, especially for climate change. They are now looking at 2050, 2100. They are looking at long term. They are not looking even to 2030. For them, 2030 is already here. So, so this kind of a long-term prognosis and what things can happen, how they can happen, is very important. And that's why you said about, but also at the same time, I believe that with this pandemic, hopefully, there have been enough of policymakers and for them to understand that even though it might at the short term not be as how to say, as attractive to them as possible, that they can only accomplish things if they look long term, and that they and we have now seen with a forceful shutdown of economies that I told you there have been studies that have shown that the largest reduction was in the transport area, right? So, and it's ground transport. So there can be a rethinking of you know, how people can do business, and whether really there needs to be the use of transport in the same way that was done before. So there are a lot of things that can be looked at the different ways how can be done. And I think that the awareness also among companies, because companies are the ones who drive a lot, especially multinationals and big companies. They are the ones who are driving the whole economy and all of that. That there is this kind of awareness also among consumers, among customers, that you have to look at what they are doing, and that you can make also your own choices. So I think that kind of awareness, I think, is much more there, and that is something which you need to do. And you know, I often I can hear when people are talking about climate change, is about doom and gloom, like, oh, we are going so far that we are never going to get back. We are all going to be doomed, right? And then everybody can say, okay, so that's going to happen anyway, so why should I bother? And I think that's a wrong approach, because I think, and actually the scientists who are dealing with this, and also the modelers who are looking at different scenarios, have shown that yes, you can still turn the wheel around, so to say, and you can still do it. And then everybody should start from themselves. And that's what I think, and that's why I have been so passionate about sustainable development, because I believe that that every one of us should look at what we are doing and at our lifestyles and what we can do and what we can contribute. I have always tried in whole of my life to try to make lives better for other people. And if I can help a little bit, and even in each of us can help a little bit, then it can, you know, it can have a domino effect, and a lot of people will be better off. So I think that is very important. And I think that a lot of, when I'm reading and when I'm talking to people who work in companies, because I also have a lot of exchanges and relations, and I also give talks like this one, for example, to them as well. They are aware of it, and I recently had, like a couple of months ago, a presentation to Minnesota companies that as you might know, they have a large health sector there. And there are a lot of these companies who are trying to do things, and they are large companies, so they can really make the difference. But also the consumers are also making their choices, and I believe that if all of us make the right choices, for example, another thing is about talking about long term, is about investments. So you need investments in infrastructure, and this is all long term. You cannot do it from one day to another. And we are, all of us have some kind of pension funds, even if you are young, but if you start working, you already start contributing to some sort of a pension fund. right? So people are now, and I have talked to these employees of the pension funds. People are now looking at where the pension funds are putting their money in, whether they are putting it into a coal plant or they are putting it to renewable energy, for example. So they are also, you know, because it's their money, they are putting their money, they are basically working with their money. So they are also much more aware of it. And they are also looking, okay, so let's see, where can you tell me, where are you putting my money? I want my money here and there, I don't want it somewhere else. So, you know, this kind of awareness is very important. And I believe that starting from ourselves and then making the right choices will also reinforce this kind of building better, building back better from this pandemic, and might in the end actually prove to be an opportunity in this sense.
I must say that I completely agree with you, Irena. I think that it is very important that people change their behavior, that they stop buying stuff that they do not need, that they stop building up our garbage, and that they take responsibility that the next new thing is not the best thing for them. And then that certainly will influence the manufacturers. If they do not have the customers, they're going to be exploiting the situation much more. I think that, and the fact that people need to be aware that part of life, a great part of life, is learning how to deal with stress and rather deal with it effectively rather than becoming how should I put it, alcoholics or shopaholics, or people that cannot contain their own feelings and go and have to do something that is destructive to themselves and ultimately to others. That's absolutely a very, very important statement that you made.
And this reminds me also that, yesterday was the World Ocean Day. Last week was the World Environment Day. I was also dealing with oceans. I organized the first UN Ocean Conference in 2017. And one of the choices that we can make is about plastics, because the forecasts are if we do not contain the use of plastics, microplastics and plastics as such, there will be more plastics in the ocean than fish by 2050. So and we know how oceans are important for our lives. Without oceans, there is no human lives, because they are the largest sources of oxygen and many other things. So not to go into details, but oceans are essential for the life on Earth. So next time when you see a plastic bottle, maybe you should have your own little canteen and pass on the plastic.
I think that what you're saying is very true, but one of the big problems was that, if you remember, about 20 years ago, there was a push to make biodegradable plastics. And instead of having these containers of plastic that could be put up, the biodegradable plastic becomes tiny, and then that tiny little particles gets immune in everything, including our own life and our own tissues. Yes. And basically one of the first things that they could do is go back, get rid of the biodegradable plastic, which doesn't really exist because it doesn't degrade, and make plastics that at least it could be picked up and you can see it, instead of both us and the fish consuming it and ending up with plastics in their organism. Very true.
Excellent. I think overall great comments, and I think Dr. Durbach, Irena, you both are very spot on that this crisis has just shaken the entire world, from businesses to consumers to governments, in really changing our behaviors. So I think I have one last question for you, Mr. Zubcevic, if you can sort of answer it within our time frame. As your background, you're a sociologist and a diplomat, and by expertise, you're an expert in public policy. So what would you say are sort of the key ambitious policies that governments can create that can put us back on track, whether it's individuals, governments, societies, on the whole, that can really have a transformative impact coming out of the pandemic and putting us back on track for the SDGs?
Well, I think I already answered in part in my last question, in my last reply, and that is about long term. Which is it's important to look where you are investing and where you are and you have to have policies that are conducive to that. So it's really important to see what you are going to, what kind of policies you are making, and to have the most important thing, because the policies will differ from country to country, because countries have different realities, they have different systems of governance, they have different cultures and so on. But what is important for policymakers is really to look at the data, at the scientific evidence, and to really get the informed policies. So policies that will work for them. Because different countries have different issues. I have been supporting countries on preparing their voluntary national reviews, which are the reviews of where countries are nationally in implementing the 2030 agenda. And of course, some issues are across the board. For example, one of the issues that all countries have is the issue of data. And how you can gather data, how you can desegregate data in order to be able to get informed policies. So it's very important for countries to establish their priorities, to identify what are the issues that they are having, and then gather scientific evidence, gather data, to see what are the policies that need to address these particular issues. And as I said, it will be different from country to country. One example that have shown in many countries is the public health institutions. In many countries, they are not to the level that they should be, or people don't have access to them. So probably one of the things that they would have to look at is how to strengthen these institutions. There are a lot of people who don't have access to health coverage. So something that the United Nations have been promoting quite a lot, and there was a big meeting on that last September, is universal health coverage, how that can be achieved. So depending on each country, these things might be different, but what is very important is to identify what are the challenges, to identify the priorities, but also to see how whatever you do in one sector or in one goal, whatever you call it, in one area, how it can impact negatively or positively on the other areas. So if you have a very well educated population, that would mean that immediately you would have a lot of benefits from that, from making the right choices in your families, making the right choices in your societies, because you are informed and you know what the issues are. So so it's very, so if you have a good education system, and if you have your population which has access to this education system, that can be a big way of achieving many other things. And you mentioned at the other, you also mentioned in your previous question about how with the digitalization, many people will lose their jobs, which is true, but many new jobs will be also made available. And you need to have a different type of skills for that. So it's very important to look for countries, if they are having this kind of issues, to look how they can retool the people and how they can make them use some different skills. So I think that, as I said, it's different from each country to country, but the most important is get your scientific information, get your data, and get the policies right, and then stick to them, and also look at the impact that these policies have had. So if they don't have the impact you desire, make a course change, try to do something better, and also make it very much accessible to all of the population of your country.
Thank you very much, Irena. That was just wonderful. I'm glad that you could take the time to join us and share your knowledge and experience with us.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Again, thank you so much, Irena, for presenting your views. For everyone who joined this session will also be uploaded on WIT's YouTube account, so you can always go back to this presentation and listen to Ms. Zubcevic's insights once again, and share them on social media. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Richard Whitehouse, who's on the board of World Information Transfer, on the 10th of June, an absolute expert on environment and climate change. So please dial in, look out for the invitation. And again, join me in please thanking Ms. Zubcevic for taking out the time and speaking to us about these very important issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.